The Amritsar Massacre lays bare the cold brutality of the British Empire in India. On April 13, 1919, thousands of unarmed civilians gathered peacefully in Jallianwala Bagh, a walled garden in Punjab, to protest colonial oppression in India. General Reginald Dyer, enraged by their defiance, ordered his troops to block the narrow exits and then open fire without warning. For 10 relentless minutes, 1,600 rounds tore through the trapped crowd. People screamed, collapsing in pools of blood as bullets pierced their skulls and chests. Families were shredded, children clinging to their dying parents. Some leapt into a well to escape, only to drown or be crushed beneath others. Official counts claim 379 dead, but Indian estimates exceed 1,000, with many more injured left to writhe in agony overnight. The general showed no remorse, later boasting he aimed to strike terror into India. This wasn't crowd control. It was a deliberate slaughter, meant to crush a nation's spirit. The massacre ignited India's fight for freedom, exposing the empire's heartless grip on its colonial jewel. The transatlantic slave trade from the 16th to 19th centuries reveals the British Empire's ruthless cruelty, as it tore over 3 million Africans from their homes to fuel colonial wealth. The Middle Passage was a floating nightmare as enslaved people, chained wrist to ankle, were crammed into dark, airless shipholds. Ravaged by dysentery and smallpox, many died during the grueling journey, their bodies tossed overboard to trailing sharks. Survivors bore the scars from iron collars and branding irons seared into their flesh. On the British plantations, the horror continued with 16-hour days, cutting cane under the blistering sun and whips flaying their backs to bone for slowing down. Malnutrition and exhaustion killed many by their 30s. Women faced rape by overseers and had to watch their children born into chains. Punishments were sadistic, with rebels being boiled alive or hung in cages, left to rot in agony as a warning. Britain's ports such as Liverpool and Bristol grew filthy rich, while African societies were left shattered. This was a merciless machine of suffering, built on the insatiable British greed. In October 1775, the British Empire unleashed its cruelty on Falmouth, Massachusetts, now Portland, Maine, in a barbaric act of vengeance during the Revolutionary War. To punish patriot defiance, British naval captain Henry Mowat, under orders, bombarded the defenseless town with cannon fire and incendiary shells. Over 400 homes, shops, and churches were reduced to smoldering ruins, the flames devouring livelihoods as families fled in terror. Men, women, and children shivered in the autumn cold, their possessions buried in ash with no warning or chance to evacuate. British Marines landed to torch what remained, ensuring total destruction. The attack, targeting civilians with no strategic value, left over 1,000 people homeless, facing winter with nothing but despair. This wasn't warfare, it was deliberate terror, meant to break the American spirit, but it only fueled the fire of rebellion. During the Boer War, from 1899 to 1902, the British Empire's savagery reached a chilling peak with its concentration camps, designed to crush resistance and secure South Africa's riches. To break the spirit of the opposition, British forces rounded up 250,000 civilians, mostly women and children, and herded them into camps. Conditions were barbaric, and rancid food rations left inmates skeletal, their skin clinging to bones. Diseases such as typhus, measles, and dysentery rampaged through overcrowded, filthy tents, with the sewage mixing with drinking water. Over 25,000 children under 16 died, their small bodies piled into mass graves. British guards, indifferent to the agony, enforced harsh discipline, whipping or starving those who protested. These camps weren't just containment. They were instruments of terror, calculated to destroy a people for gold and diamonds. In 1938, during Palestine's Arab Revolt, the British Empire's brutality erupted in the Al-Bassa Massacre, a chilling act of retribution. After a roadside bomb killed 4 British soldiers near Al-Bassa, a Galilean village, British troops from the Royal Ulster Rifles descended with vengeance. They rounded up 50 Palestinian men, forced them onto a bus, then detonated it with a grenade, shredding bodies in a blast of fire and metal. Survivors, bloodied and screaming, were then ruthlessly machine-gunned down. Others faced torture, beaten to death with rifle butts, their homes looted and torched. The village was razed, leaving women and children homeless amid the smoldering ruins. Their deaths, a diabolical reminder of colonial control. This wasn't justice, it was a savage act of terror, crushing Palestinian resistance with merciless violence. The Bengal Famine of 1943 stands as a harrowing testament to the British Empire's callous indifference, claiming 2 to 3 million lives in India. As World War II raged, a cyclone and drought struck Bengal, but British policies turned hardship into horror. Colonial authorities exported rice to feed Allied troops and stockpiled grain for post-war Britain, leaving Bengalis to starve. Emaciated families, their bodies reduced to skin and bone, scavenged for roots and bark, with their lips cracked and eyes sunken from hunger. Children's bellies swelled with severe malnutrition, their cries fading into the silence. Corpses piled up in the streets and were eaten by dogs as dysentery swept through the weakened survivors. Winston Churchill, dismissive of Indian suffering, blamed Bengalis for, quote, breeding like vermin and diverted ships to his military needs. Relief was a cruel joke as meager rations reached few. This wasn't just neglect, it was a deliberate choice to prioritize imperial gain over millions of lives. In 1763, Pontiac's rebellion ignited as native tribes, including the Ottawa, Lenape, and Shawnee, resisted British expansion after the French and Indian War. The British Empire's response was vicious, marked by cruelty that scarred the Great Lakes region. At Fort Pitt, British Commander Geoffrey Amherst approved the heinous act of distributing smallpox-infected blankets and handkerchiefs to the natives, deliberately unleashing an epidemic. Entire villages succumbed with a fever ravaging their bodies, covering them in oozing sores, killing entire families in agony. British and colonial militias also raided native settlements, torching homes and crops, leaving survivors to starve in the wilderness. Thousands perished in these attacks, their scalps sometimes taken as trophies. This wasn't just suppression, it was a brutal campaign of extermination, using disease and fire to crush native resistance for British dominance. In 1897, the British Empire unleashed a savage, unprovoked assault on the Benin Kingdom, a sophisticated Western African civilization, in a so-called punitive expedition that was nothing short of cultural annihilation. After a trade dispute, British forces invaded Benin City in Nigeria with ruthless intent. They massacred hundreds of men, women, and children, bayoneting resistors and mowing down fleeing civilians with Maxim guns, leaving the streets stained with blood and littered with corpses. The city's magnificent palaces, adorned with intricate carvings, were torched, their flames consuming centuries of history. British troops looted thousands of priceless bronze sculptures and ivory artifacts and carted them off to London's museums. This wasn't just conquest, but a deliberate erasure of a proud culture, reducing a thriving society to ashes for British greed. The Irish potato famine from 1845 to 1852 was a catastrophe that killed roughly 1 million people and forced another 1 to 2 million to flee Ireland. But it was no mere act of nature. Under British colonial rule, Ireland's suffering was magnified by policies that prioritized profit over human lives, turning a crop failure into a nightmare of starvation and despair. The potato blight, a fungal disease, obliterated Ireland's staple crop, turning entire fields into a black, rotting sludge. British landlords exported Ireland's remaining wheat and cattle, enough to feed millions, while evicting tenants, burning their homes, and leaving them to freeze or starve in makeshift mud shelters. Many attempted to escape to America, but passengers, weakened by famine, succumbed to fever in cramped airless holds, their bodies dumped into the Atlantic, sometimes still breathing. This wasn't just famine, it was a man-made disaster, prioritizing profit over lives, scarring Ireland forever. The Opium Wars from 1839 to 1860 exposed the British Empire's ruthless greed, as it forced addiction on China to line its pockets. To offset trade deficits from tea and silk imports, Britain flooded China with opium grown in colonial India. Many began to waste away in opium dens, their bodies trembling, minds enslaved to the drug. When China banned the trade, Britain unleashed war. British warships bombarded coastal cities, their cannons killing thousands of civilians. Outgunned, China was forced into the Treaty of Nanking, giving away Hong Kong and opening ports to British exploitation once again. By the 1850s, over 10 million Chinese were hooked and Britain's merchants grew rich. Their ships, laden with silver, while Chinese society unraveled, families starved, and children begged beside their parents' corpses. This wasn't trade, it was predation, a calculated assault on a nation's soul, with Britain's gunboats enforcing misery for profit. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya from 1952 to 1960 was met with the British Empire's savage brutality, as it crushed a fight for land and freedom with unrelenting cruelty. The Kikuyu, demanding their stolen lands, faced a colonial onslaught. British forces detained up to 80,000 suspected Mau Mau supporters and placed them in camps with torture chambers. Prisoners endured beatings, electric shocks, and castrations, their screams echoing through barbed wire enclosures. Starvation rations left inmates skeletal, while dysentery and typhoid ravaged their bodies. Villages were burned and livestock slaughtered, leaving families homeless and starving. The British troops and loyalist militias executed suspects without trial, then dumped their bodies in mass graves. Estimates suggest tens of thousands died, possibly more than 100,000 as Britain used collective punishment to terrorize the Kikuyu. This wasn't just suppression, it was a calculated campaign of horror to protect colonial profits, leaving Kenya scarred with trauma and loss. In 1879, the British Empire's invasion of Zululand, driven by an insatiable lust for land and resources, unleashed brutal devastation with the Zulu War and the Battle of Rorke's Drift. British forces, seeking to crush Zulu resistance, burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and massacred civilians, leaving grain supplies in ashes causing starvation and panic. At Isandlwana, 20,000 Zulus overwhelmed a British column, but the empire retaliated mercilessly. At Rorke's Drift, a small British garrison faced 4,000 Zulu warriors, firing volleys that cut down hundreds, their bodies piling in blood-soaked heaps. The British used superior rifles and bayonets to slaughter wave after wave, leaving over 500 Zulus dead in a single night. The war's broader toll of 8,000 Zulu lives lost destroyed communities, all to secure British dominance. This wasn't defense, it was colonial savagery, shattering a proud nation for imperial gain. From 1788, the British Empire's colonization of Australia unleashed a relentless wave of cruelty on indigenous peoples, obliterating lives and cultures for land and power. Settlers, backed by British troops, waged the frontier wars, massacring thousands with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 100,000 indigenous deaths. From 1788, the British Empire's colonization of Australia unleashed a relentless wave of cruelty on indigenous peoples, obliterating lives and cultures for land and power. Settlers, backed by British troops, waged the frontier wars, massacring thousands with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 100,000 indigenous deaths. The stolen generations tore children from their mothers, caging them in a mission to erase their culture, with many facing abuse, starvation, and early death. This wasn't settlement, it was genocide, a calculated erasure of 60,000 years of heritage, leaving indigenous Australians scarred by British greed. The Malayan Emergency from 1948 to 1960 exposed the British Empire's cruel neglect as it crushed a communist insurgency to protect its rubber and tin wealth, but at the same time displaced over 500,000 people. These were mostly ethnic Chinese that were forced into what they termed new villages, but were actually just fence camps with curfews and starvation rations. Families were torn from homes, their villages torched, crops destroyed, leaving them to fester in squalor. Torture was rampant. Suspects were beaten, burned, or electrocuted, with hundreds dying during interrogation. British troops executed civilians without trial, dumping bodies in the jungles while chemical defoliants poisoned the rice fields, starving communities. Thousands perished during this ruthless campaign. This wasn't peacekeeping, it was colonial terror, sacrificing Malayan lives to secure British profits. From 1946 to 1949, the British Empire's Cypriot internment camps revealed its heartless cruelty, imprisoning over 53,000 Jewish Holocaust survivors desperate to reach Palestine. Housed in 12 camps surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, these refugees, mostly young orphans, faced harsh conditions. Food was scarce and sanitation was abysmal, breeding disease that killed 400. British guards treated detainees like prisoners of war, denying men release to hinder Israel's war efforts. Fence rushes were met with gunfire, wounding desperate survivors who'd already endured Nazi horrors. This wasn't detention, it was a callous betrayal, caging hope for British control.